May 11, 1945. 70 miles off the coast of Okinawa, the Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly under a clear morning sky. On the flight deck of USS Bunker Hill, sailors in sweat-soaked dungarees move with practiced precision. The carrier cuts through calm waters at 25 knots, her deck crowded with corsairs and Hellcats being readied for another strike. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with salt air. Then the lookouts scream. A Zero fighter emerges from the clouds, diving nearly vertical toward the carrier. Before gunners can track him, he slams into the flight deck. An instant later, a second kamikaze strikes 30 seconds behind the first. Fire erupts across the deck. 393 men die in minutes. Yet even as flames consume the forward section, the aft crew prepares to launch fighters. The remaining Hellcats roar off the burning deck within the hour. Japanese pilots circling above cannot comprehend what they witness. The American carrier should be dying, but instead, it fights. The story begins not with kamikaze attacks, but with a revolution in naval warfare that transformed the Pacific theater between 1942 and 1945. When the United States entered World War II, aircraft carriers represented a new, untested weapon. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor proved their devastating potential, but it also exposed a crucial reality. Carrier warfare would be won not just by superior aircraft or brave pilots, but by the men who kept those planes flying. The ability to launch, recover, refuel, rearm, and relaunch aircraft faster than the enemy became the deciding factor in every major carrier battle of the Pacific War. In early 1944, the American naval offensive gathered unstoppable momentum. The Central Pacific Campaign moved within striking distance of Japan itself, driven by a new generation of carriers that dwarfed anything previously imagined. The SX-class fleet carriers, 27,000 tons of steel and determination, began joining the fleet in numbers that horrified Japanese naval planners. USS Essex herself commissioned in December 1942, followed by Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, and a stream of sister ships that rolled from American shipyards at a pace Japan could not match. Each Essex-class carrier operated 90 to 100 aircraft, carried enough fuel and ammunition for sustained operations, and featured design innovations that revolutionized flight deck operations. The contrast with Japanese carrier development could not have been starker. By mid-1944, Japan's carrier fleet consisted of survivors from earlier battles and hastily converted vessels that never approached the capability of purpose-built warships. The catastrophic losses at Midway in June 1942 had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The battles around Guadalcanal throughout late 1942 and early 1943 consumed more carriers and pilots in grinding attrition. Japan built replacement carriers, but building ships proved far easier than training crews to operate them effectively. The intricate ballet of carrier aviation required thousands of hours of practice, and by 1944, Japan no longer had the fuel, time, or safe waters to conduct proper training. American carrier doctrine evolved rapidly through hard-won experience. The desperate carrier battles of 1942 taught American commanders crucial lessons about air group composition, combat air patrol procedures, and damage control. By 1943, these lessons crystallized into standard operating procedures that spread through the growing fleet. Task Force 58, the fast carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, represented the culmination of this evolution. 15 carriers operating as a coordinated unit could put over 900 aircraft into the sky, overwhelming any Japanese force through sheer numbers and operational efficiency. The men who made this system work came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa handled ammunition. Factory workers from Detroit operated catapults. College graduates from New England navigated the ships. They drilled endlessly, practicing emergency procedures until they became automatic reflexes. Flight deck crews trained to move aircraft with choreographed precision, every man knowing his role in the complex dance of naval aviation. This training made the difference between a carrier that could launch aircraft and one that could launch them fast enough to matter in combat. The technological advantages built into American carriers gave their crews the tools to achieve unprecedented efficiency. Essex-class carriers featured open hangar decks that allowed rapid aircraft movement. Deck edge elevators positioned on the side of the ship rather than in the middle of the flight deck kept the landing area clear during recovery operations. Powerful catapults assisted launches in all weather conditions. Sophisticated arresting gear brought planes to controlled stops within feet. Most critically, the flight deck layout and aircraft spotting procedures allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations when necessary, something Japanese carriers struggled to achieve. By June 1944, this carrier force prepared to strike into the Marianas Islands, bringing American air power within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese carrier force entering the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 represented Japan's last hope for a decisive naval victory, but it carried fatal weaknesses that no amount of courage could overcome. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with 440 aircraft, a force that appeared formidable on paper. Beneath the surface, however, the Japanese carrier fleet suffered from crippling limitations in doctrine, training, and operational capability that would prove catastrophic when matched against the American system. Japanese carrier doctrine prioritized the first strike. Japanese carriers trained to launch coordinated attacks with devastating speed, sending large formations of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes against enemy fleets before the opponent could respond. This approach worked brilliantly at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean raids of early 1942. It failed catastrophically at Midway when American forces detected the Japanese fleet first and caught Japanese carriers with armed aircraft on deck, waiting to launch. The explosions that followed destroyed 4 carriers in minutes. Yet even after Midway, Japanese doctrine never fully adapted to the reality of radar-directed combat air patrols that could intercept attacking formations far from their targets. The collapse of Japanese pilot training after 1942 created an invisible but fatal wound. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators underwent brutally difficult training that produced superbly skilled pilots. Many had combat experience in China. They flew aircraft like the Zero fighter with extraordinary proficiency. But this elite force could not be rapidly expanded or easily replaced when losses mounted. Japanese training programs required years to produce carrier-qualified pilots, and by 1943, Japan lacked the fuel, aircraft, and time to maintain peacetime training standards. Pilots arrived at frontline units with a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors possessed. American pilot training followed a different model, one built for industrial-scale war. The United States established a vast training pipeline that produced thousands of pilots annually. Training bases across the southern United States enjoyed unlimited fuel, safe flying weather, and abundant aircraft. Instructors rotated back from combat zones, bringing current tactical knowledge to new students. American pilots arrived at carrier squadrons with extensive flight time and standardized training that made them interchangeable parts in the naval aviation machine. When experienced pilots completed combat tours, they rotated home to train the next generation, preserving and spreading hard-won knowledge throughout the expanding force. The technical differences between American and Japanese carriers extended beyond size and aircraft capacity. Japanese carriers rearmed and refueled aircraft in the hangar deck below the flight deck, a safer procedure in theory, but one that significantly increased turnaround time. American carriers performed these dangerous operations on the flight deck itself, accepting the risk of fire and explosion in exchange for speed. Fuel lines ran directly to deck refueling stations. Ordnance crews wheeled bombs and ammunition carts to aircraft within minutes of landing. The entire system prioritized operational tempo over safety margins, gambling that faster turnaround times would prove more valuable than marginally reduced fire risk. American damage control procedures represented another critical advantage. Every Essex-class carrier carried extensive firefighting equipment, trained damage control parties, and compartmentalization that could isolate flooding or fire. Sailors drilled constantly on damage control procedures, practicing fighting fires, shoring up damaged bulkheads, and maintaining propulsion even with significant battle damage. Japanese carriers incorporated some of these features, but Japanese damage control doctrine emphasized preventing damage rather than surviving it once inflicted. When American bombs or torpedoes penetrated Japanese carriers at Midway, poor damage control allowed aviation fuel vapors to spread through the ships, triggering catastrophic secondary explosions. The strategic situation by mid-1944 forced Japan into an impossible position. American submarines controlled the sea lanes, interdicting the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The Japanese fleet could not train properly without fuel, could not sortie for major operations without risking its remaining strength, and could not avoid decisive battle without surrendering control of the Pacific to American forces island-hopping toward the home islands. Admiral Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, understood that Operation A-Go represented Japan's final chance to destroy enough American carriers to force a negotiated peace. He committed everything to the coming battle, knowing failure meant the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The American carrier fleet steaming toward the Marianas understood none of this strategic desperation, focusing instead on the immediate operational challenge of destroying Japanese air power and supporting the Saipan invasion, unaware they were about to witness the greatest carrier battle in history. The real heroes of American carrier aviation never flew a plane. They wore color-coded jerseys and worked in conditions that bordered on controlled chaos. Yellow shirts directed aircraft movement with practiced hand signals, guiding pilots through crowded deck parks where wingtips cleared each other by feet. Red shirts handled ordnance, wheeling 500-pound bombs and belts of 50-caliber ammunition with casual confidence despite knowing one mistake could kill dozens. Blue shirts chalked and chained aircraft, ensuring planes stayed secured during launches and landings. Green shirts operated the catapults and arresting gear that made flight operations possible. These men, most barely 20 years old, orchestrated a dangerous ballet where one misstep meant death. The pace they maintained astonished anyone who witnessed it. An F6F Hellcat would trap aboard, catching an arresting wire that brought it from 100 miles per hour to a complete stop in 200 feet. Before the propeller finished spinning down, deck crews swarmed the aircraft, chocks under the wheels, chains securing the tail, the plane director signaling the pilot to fold wings and taxi forward. 30 seconds after landing, the Hellcat rolled toward the bow. Behind it, another fighter approached for landing, the deck already clear. This happened again and again, aircraft recovering at intervals measured in seconds rather than minutes. Rearming and refueling happened with the same intensity. Ordnance crews opened ammunition bays and reloaded 6 50-caliber machine guns with practiced speed. Fuel hoses connected to wing tanks, pumping hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline while other crews loaded bombs onto wing racks. The entire process took 30 to 45 minutes under normal conditions, faster in emergencies. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, some aircraft took tows, turned around in under 30 minutes, launching back into combat while Japanese pilots still searched for the American fleet. The men who performed this work trained relentlessly. In harbor, they practiced aircraft movements until every man knew his position and timing. They drilled emergency procedures, learning to fight fires, clear crashed aircraft from the deck, and maintain operations even under attack. This training created muscle memory that functioned even when fear and fatigue clouded conscious thought. When kamikazes struck USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, killing nearly 400 men and setting the carrier ablaze, surviving deck crews continued working. They fought fires, pushed burning aircraft overboard, and cleared the aft deck for emergency landings, all while the ship's ammunition exploded around them. The human element made the technical system work. The Essex-class flight deck measured 862 feet long and just over 100 feet wide. Every inch served a purpose. Forward catapults could launch aircraft when wind conditions made deck runs impossible. The landing area stretched 300 feet aft, enough room for pilots to catch one of 9 arresting wires even if they missed the first 8. Deck edge elevators moved aircraft between hangar and flight deck in under a minute without blocking landing operations. Crash barriers could be raised in seconds to protect deck-parked aircraft from a plane that missed all arresting wires. The entire system reflected years of operational experience distilled into ship design. The open hangar deck below the flight deck allowed rapid aircraft movement and maintenance. Unlike British carriers with armored hangar decks that offered protection but limited space, American carriers sacrificed armor for capacity and flexibility. The hangar deck could hold additional aircraft beyond the flight deck capacity, and maintenance crews could work on multiple planes simultaneously. Elevators constantly cycled aircraft between levels, keeping the flight deck clear for operations, while preparing the next launch group below. American carriers pioneered the deck park concept, storing armed and fueled aircraft on the flight deck itself rather than in the hangar. This practice accepted significant risk. A single bomb hitting the deck park could destroy dozens of aircraft. but it maximized the number of planes available for immediate launch. During major operations, Essex-class carriers routinely operated 100 or more aircraft, far exceeding their designed capacity. The June 19, 1944 battle saw American carriers launch 450 aircraft in a single strike, overwhelming Japanese defenses through sheer numbers. The American Naval Aviation Training System functioned like an industrial assembly line, producing standardized products at predictable rates. It began with primary flight training at bases across the southern United States, where cadets learned basic flying skills in trainers like the Stearman biplane. Those who survived moved to advanced training, flying more powerful aircraft, and learning navigation, gunnery, and carrier procedures. The final stage involved carrier qualification aboard training carriers operating near the coast, where pilots practiced the terrifying procedure of landing on a moving ship. The entire process took roughly 18 months and produced pilots with 300 to 400 flight hours, far more than Japanese pilots received by 1944. Maintenance training followed similar patterns. Mechanics learned aircraft systems at shore-based schools before joining fleet units. Ordnance specialists trained on the weapons and loading procedures they would use in combat. Flight deck crews practiced at naval air stations with mock carrier decks before deploying to actual ships. This systematic training created crews that could integrate quickly into carrier operations, maintaining readiness even as individual sailors rotated through the fleet. The system proved its worth during 1944 when American carrier forces conducted continuous operations for months, with replacement pilots and crews arriving regularly to maintain combat effectiveness. Japanese pilots approaching American task forces in 1944 and 1945 encountered a nightmare that defied their training and experience. They expected to face combat air patrols, but not the layered defense that actually awaited them. Radar detected their formations 50 to 75 miles out, giving American carriers time to vector fighters to intercept positions. The first F6F Hellcats hit Japanese formations 20 to 30 miles from the American ships, breaking up coordinated attacks before they reached striking range. Those attackers who fought through the first interception encountered additional Hellcat divisions between them and their targets. The few who survived to reach the task force faced walls of anti-aircraft fire from escorting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. What horrified Japanese pilots most was the sheer number of American fighters. They would shoot down Hellcats, see them falling toward the ocean, then watch more Hellcats appear from nowhere to replace them. This seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of carrier operations. Japanese carriers could launch a major strike or maintain a combat air patrol, but not both simultaneously without significant delays. American carriers somehow sustained continuous operations, launching strikes while maintaining 50 to 70 fighters on combat air patrol at all times. Japanese pilots concluded that the Americans must have many more carriers than intelligence estimates indicated, not understanding that superior operational procedures allowed American carriers to do more with the same resources. The kamikaze pilots who attacked American carriers during the Okinawa campaign in 1945 reported similar impossibilities. They watched their wingmen crash into carrier decks, saw explosions and fires that should have crippled the ships, yet minutes later observed fighters launching from those SAMI carriers. Some kamikaze pilots claimed Americans possessed supernatural protection, that their ships could not be killed. The truth was more prosaic but equally impressive. American damage control and operational discipline allowed carriers to continue functioning even with significant battle damage. Fires that would have doomed Japanese carriers were contained and extinguished while flight operations continued on undamaged portions of the deck. Japanese naval officers studied American carrier operations through reconnaissance reports and pilot debriefings, trying to understand how the Americans achieved such operational tempo. Some recognized the truth, that American carriers had revolutionized flight deck procedures and crew training to achieve efficiency Japanese carriers could not match. But by 1944, Japan lacked the resources, time, and fuel to implement similar reforms even if they had wanted to. The war had become a race Japan was losing, and American carrier efficiency widened the gap with each passing month. June 19, 1944, demonstrated American carrier efficiency on a scale that shattered Japanese naval aviation forever. Vice Admiral Ozawa launched his aircraft in 4 waves throughout the day, spacing them roughly an hour apart. He believed this phased approach would overwhelm American defenses by forcing continuous combat that would exhaust American pilots and deplete ammunition. Instead, the staggered attacks played perfectly into American strengths, allowing Task Force 58 to deal with each wave separately while maintaining fresh fighters on combat air patrol through rapid deck turnarounds. The first Japanese wave of 69 aircraft launched at 08:30 and approached the American fleet around 1000. Radar detected them at 150 miles, giving ample warning. Mitscher's carriers launched additional fighters to reinforce the combat air patrol, putting over 200 Hellcats in the air. The fighters intercepted the Japanese formation 40 miles out and slaughtered them. Of 69 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 survived to reach the American fleet, and anti-aircraft fire destroyed most of those. One bomb hit battleship South Dakota, causing moderate damage. The other 130 attacking aircraft achieved nothing before being shot down or forced to turn back. While the battle raged overhead, American carriers continued normal operations. Aircraft returning from earlier missions recovered, refueled, and rearmed. Fresh fighters launched to maintain combat air patrol strength. The flight decks hummed with activity that never stopped, never slowed, never gave the enemy a respite. The second Japanese wave arrived around 1100, then the third and fourth at intervals throughout the afternoon. Each met the same fate: interception far from the fleet, overwhelming fighter opposition, and destruction. By sunset, Admiral Ozawa had fewer than 100 operational aircraft remaining from the 440 he started with. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, mostly to operational causes rather than combat. The battle earned its nickname from Commander Paul Buey of USS Lexington, who remarked after landing, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." His observation captured the one-sided nature of the battle, but it understated the systematic efficiency that made the turkey shoot possible. American carriers had achieved operational superiority so complete that Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The battle demonstrated that carrier warfare had become less about individual pilot skill and more about system efficiency, and the American system had no equal. The industrial reality behind American carrier dominance told a story of production capacity that Japan could never match. In 1943 and 1944, American shipyards launched 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, along with dozens of light carriers and escort carriers. Japan commissioned 4 fleet carriers during the same period, losing 3 of them before they became operationally effective. American aircraft production reached staggering numbers: 12,000 F6F Hellcats manufactured between 1942 and 1945, along with thousands of dive bombers and torpedo planes. Japanese factories struggled to produce hundreds of aircraft per month, constantly falling behind attrition rates. The numbers extended beyond ships and aircraft. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of naval aviators in 1944 alone. Japan trained hundreds. American carriers deployed with full complements of experienced maintenance personnel, ordnance specialists, and flight deck crews. Japanese carriers increasingly relied on partially trained crews who learned on the job, if they survived long enough to learn. By mid-1944, the average American carrier pilot had more than 400 flight hours before his first combat mission. The average Japanese replacement pilot arrived at his squadron with fewer than 100 hours and no carrier landing experience, learning to trap aboard a carrier while dodging American submarines and aircraft. These numbers created a cumulative advantage that compounded over time. Every American carrier sunk or damaged could be replaced within months by new construction. Every lost pilot could be replaced within weeks from the training pipeline. Japan possessed no such depth. Each carrier lost represented an irreplaceable strategic asset. Each experienced pilot killed meant more green replacements flying missions they were unprepared for. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with deeper reserves and faster replacement rates, and no amount of Japanese courage or tactical skill could overcome that fundamental imbalance in the war's final years. The Battle of the Philippine Sea opened with American submarines detecting Admiral Ozawa's fleet on June 15, 1944. USS Flying Fish spotted the main Japanese force steaming toward the Marianas, reporting 15 ships including what appeared to be several carriers. For the next 4 days, American submarines shadowed the Japanese fleet, sending contact reports to Admiral Spruance and his fast carrier commander, Admiral Mitcher. The American carrier force positioned itself west of Saipan, where Marines were already ashore fighting for control of the island. Mitcher wanted to steam westward and strike the Japanese carriers at dawn, catching them before they could launch. Spruance refused, concerned about leaving the Saipan invasion force vulnerable to an end-run attack. The decision frustrated Mitcher but reflected sound strategic thinking. The primary mission was protecting American ground forces, not seeking naval battle. June 19th began with American carriers at general quarters before dawn, crews manning their battle stations while combat air patrols launched into the darkness. The morning search planes found nothing, and tension mounted as hours passed without contact. Then, at 1,000 hours, radar operators detected the first incoming raid, a massive formation bearing down on Task Force 58 from the west. The Hellcats went to meet them. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer led the first interception, diving his division into a formation of dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. The Japanese pilots tried to defend themselves, but found their opponents better trained, better equipped, and more numerous than anything they had faced before. Brewer's division shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in the first pass. The air battle developed into chaos that somehow maintained order through American fighter direction procedures. Radar operators aboard the carriers tracked the formations, vectoring fighters to intercept positions with calm, professional voices that betrayed no hint of the desperate battle unfolding. Bandits bearing 270, distance 40 miles, Angels 12. The radio transmissions continued throughout the battle, directing Hellcats toward new threats, calling low-fuel fighters back to land and rearm. The system worked because everyone understood their role and executed it without hesitation. On the flight decks below the air battle, organized chaos reigned. Aircraft recovered every 30 seconds, catching arresting wires and taxiing forward to clear the landing area. Ordnance crews swarmed each plane the moment it stopped, reloading ammunition and checking systems while fuel crews connected hoses to wing tanks. Pilots stayed in their cockpits during the turnaround, drinking water and eating sandwiches handed up by plane captains while their aircraft transformed from empty to combat ready. The fastest turnarounds took 25 minutes from landing to relaunch. Some fighters flew 3 or 4 combat missions that day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before going back into the fight. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu of VF-16 aboard Lexington became the face of the Turkey Shoot. Already an ace with 12 confirmed kills, Vrasiu launched during the second Japanese attack wave and positioned his division between the enemy formation and the task force. He spotted a group of Judy dive bombers without fighter escort and dove to attack. His first burst sent one Judy spinning into the ocean. The second bomber exploded under his guns. Third, fourth, fifth went down in quick succession. Vrasiu's division mates claimed the others, and the entire enemy formation was destroyed before reaching the American fleet. Vrasiu landed back aboard Lexington with empty guns and a huge grin, holding up 6 fingers to Admiral Mitcher, who watched from the bridge wing. A photographer captured the moment, America's newest ace celebrating the most lopsided carrier battle in history. Yet even amid this triumph, American submarines dealt the most devastating blows. USS Albacore stalked the Japanese carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship. At 09:16, Albacore fired 6 torpedoes. A Japanese pilot spotted the torpedo tracks and deliberately dove his plane into one torpedo, onating it short of the target. The other torpedoes missed except one, which struck Taiho on the starboard side. The damage seemed minor, and Ozawa continued directing the battle. But Taiho's inexperienced damage control officer made a fatal mistake. He opened ventilation systems to clear aviation fuel fumes from damaged tanks, spreading volatile vapors throughout the ship. At 15:32, a spark ignited the fumes, and Taiho exploded. The carrier sank rapidly, taking 1,650 men to the bottom. Ozawa transferred his flag to cruiser Haguro and later to carrier Zuikaku, continuing the battle even as his fleet disintegrated around him. USS Kavala found carrier Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. At 12:20, Kavala fired 6 torpedoes. 3 struck home, ripping massive holes in Shokaku's hull. Fires spread through the carrier as aviation fuel ignited, fed by bombs and torpedoes stored in the magazines. Shokaku's crew fought the fires for 3 hours before abandoning ship at 1500. The carrier capsized and sank at 1501, killing 1,200 men. Within 6 hours, Japan had lost 2 fleet carriers and hundreds of aircraft without inflicting meaningful damage on the American force. The second day of the Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated American operational reach and the terrible risks carrier aviation demanded. Admiral Ozawa retreated westward overnight, hoping to preserve his remaining carriers, while land-based aircraft from Guam and the Philippines struck the American fleet. He did not know American strikes had already devastated those air bases. Mitcher's carriers sent searches throughout the day, finding nothing until late afternoon when a scout plane reported Japanese carriers 300 miles to the west. The range exceeded safe striking distance, meaning attacking aircraft would face darkness and fuel exhaustion on the return fly. Mitcher made the decision in seconds. Launch everything. 216 aircraft took off from American carriers beginning at 16:24 hours, racing westward toward an enemy fleet now 350 miles distant. The sun hung low on the horizon when they found Ozawa's ships at 1840. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol consisted of 35 fighters against 200 American attackers. The result was predetermined. American fighters swept aside Japanese defenders, while dive bombers and torpedo planes fell upon the carriers below. Carrier Hio took 2 torpedo hits and sank with 250 men. Carriers Zukaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda suffered bomb damage. The battleship Haruna took a bomb hit. 20 American aircraft fell to anti-aircraft fire. The strike force turned east toward their carriers as darkness fell, pilots watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty. The flight home became an ordeal. Fighters ran dry first, their pilots ditching in the ocean and hoping destroyers would find them. Bombers flew on, some making it within sight of the task force before their engines quit. Mitcher faced an impossible choice: maintain blackout conditions and lose many aircraft, or light up the carriers and risk submarine attack. He chose his pilots. At 20:45, he ordered every ship to turn on lights. Carriers illuminated their flight decks. Destroyers pointed searchlights skyward as homing beacons. The task force blazed like a city in the darkness, visible for 50 miles. Aircraft began landing, pilots exhausted and shaking from adrenaline crash. Many missed the arresting wires and crashed on deck. Others ran out of fuel while circling and ditched alongside the carriers. Throughout the night, destroyers crisscrossed the ocean, searching for downed aircrew. By dawn, rescue operations had recovered 143 of 185 pilots forced to ditch. 42 men were lost. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. Ozawa limped back to Japan with 3 carriers and fewer than 40 operational aircraft. The Americans lost 130 aircraft and 109 men, but retained 15 combat-ready carriers with full air groups. The strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Japan could no longer defend the Marianas, opening the way for American B-29 bombers to strike Japanese cities from Saipan and Tinian. The next major carrier battle would not involve Japanese carriers. There were none left worth risking. 10 months later, the operational efficiency American carriers displayed at Philippine Sea faced its ultimate test off Okinawa. The Japanese High Command, recognizing they could never defeat American carriers in conventional battle, embraced mass suicide attacks. Kamikaze tactics reflected pure desperation, deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships to destroy them through self-sacrifice. The strategy horrified American sailors while demonstrating twisted logic. Japan had plenty of barely trained pilots who could barely fly well enough to take off and point an aircraft at a target. They could not dogfight or evade fighters or execute complicated strike tactics, but they could die purposefully if that death sank an American carrier. The Okinawa campaign began April 1, 1945, with American carriers providing air support for the massive amphibious invasion. For the next 3 months, kamikazes attacked relentlessly. April 6 saw the first mass attack. 355 kamikazes and 344 escort fighters struck the invasion fleet. They sank 3 destroyers and 1 LST, damaged 24 more ships. April 12, brought another mass attack. April 16th, another. May saw the attacks continue. American carriers stood off Okinawa for 82 continuous days, the longest sustained carrier operation of the war. Flight deck crews worked 20-hour shifts, launching combat air patrols at dawn, maintaining fighters overhead all day, recovering aircraft at dusk, then preparing the deck for the next dawn launch. Sleep became a luxury measured in hours per week rather than per day. The combat air patrol procedures refined during earlier battles reached perfection off Okinawa. Radar detected incoming raids 75 miles out. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats and Corsairs to intercept positions. The fighters massacred kamikazes wholesale, shooting down hundreds before they approached the fleet. But sheer numbers meant some always got through. When they did, American carriers demonstrated the operational resilience their design and training provided. USS Hancock took a kamikaze hit on April 7th. The crash killed 62 men and started major fires. Within an hour, Hancock resumed flight operations. USS Enterprise suffered a kamikaze strike on May 14th that destroyed her forward elevator and killed 14 men. She continued landing aircraft. USS Bunker Hill took 2 kamikaze hits within 30 seconds on May 11th, creating the inferno described in this story's opening. 393 men died. The carrier should have sunk. Instead, damage control teams contained the fires, and within hours, Bunker Hill prepared to take aircraft aboard for emergency recovery. She survived to sail home under her own power. Japanese pilots could not believe what they witnessed. They saw carriers burning, exploding, listing, and continuing to fight. This violated everything they understood about carrier warfare. The reality was simple. American carriers had evolved into nearly unsinkable weapons platforms, their crews trained to sustain operations under conditions that would have destroyed lesser organizations. The system worked because every element functioned correctly. Damage control prevented fires from spreading, medical teams treated casualties, engineering spaces maintained propulsion, and flight deck crews kept launching fighters even as kamikaze crashed into their ships. The numbers from the kamikaze campaign told a story of desperate Japanese sacrifice meeting systematic American resistance. Between October 1944 and August 1945, Japan expended 2,800 aircraft in suicide attacks. These kamikazes sank 34 American ships and damaged 288 more, killing 4,900 sailors and wounding 4,800 others. The toll seemed devastating until placed in strategic context. Not a single American fleet carrier sank to kamikaze attack. No battleship was sunk. The damaged carriers returned to service after repairs, their crews replaced, their aircraft replenished. The industrial machine that produced the carriers in the first place kept them operational despite everything Japan could do. Kamikaze effectiveness varied dramatically depending on target size and defenses. Small ships like destroyers and destroyer escorts proved vulnerable, with several sinking after single hits. Larger vessels survived multiple strikes through superior damage control. The light carrier USS Intrepid suffered 5 separate kamikaze attacks between October 1944 and April 1945, surviving each time through competent damage control and sheer structural toughness. The escort carrier USS Bismarck C became the largest American carrier sunk by kamikaze when 2 attacks on February 21, 1945, caused uncontrollable fires that detonated the bomb magazines. She sank 90 minutes later with 318 men lost. But Bismarck C was a converted merchant hull never designed for combat, not a purpose-built fleet carrier like the Essex-class ships that proved nearly impossible to sink. British carriers operating as Task Force 57 in the Pacific provided dramatic proof of alternative carrier design philosophy. British carriers featured armored flight decks designed to resist bomb damage, unlike American carriers with wooden flight decks over thin steel. When kamikazes struck British carriers, they created craters and destroyed aircraft but rarely penetrated to the hangar deck or caused fatal damage. HMS Formidable took 2 kamikaze hits on May 4th and 9th, 1945. The first created a 2-foot square hole and a depression in the armored deck. 8 men died and 51 were wounded. The ship resumed flight operations the next morning. American observers marveled at this resilience. though they noted that British carriers operated fewer aircraft due to the weight and space requirements of armored decks, a trade-off American doctrine rejected in favor of maximum aircraft capacity. The human cost of sustained carrier operations fell heavily on the men least remembered in history, the flight deck crews, ordnance handlers, and maintenance personnel who kept the aircraft flying. They worked in the most dangerous environment in the Navy, where one mistake could kill a dozen men and destroy millions of dollars of equipment. Jet exhaust could blow a man overboard. Propellers could decapitate the inattentive. Arresting wires snapping under tension whipped across the deck like invisible razor wire, cutting men in half. These deaths rarely made headlines, but they accumulated. A sailor blown overboard during night operations simply vanished into the ocean. A mechanic crushed between two aircraft became a statistic. The men who survived learned to live with fear as a constant companion, channeling it into focus that kept them alive. The psychological impact of kamikaze attacks tested American sailors in ways conventional combat never did. Traditional battle featured randomness. Shells landed unpredictably. Bombs fell where aiming errors took them. Kamikazes attacked with visible, malevolent purpose. Sailors watched Japanese pilots deliberately guide their aircraft toward American ships, saw the pilots' faces in the seconds before impact. Some kamikazes waved at American ships as they dove. This personal, deliberate quality created unique psychological strain. Many sailors developed what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction, inability to sleep, hypervigilance, flashbacks to attacks. The Navy had no formal mental health support in 1945. Sailors either dealt with the strain or broke under it, in which case they were quietly transferred to non-combat duties and forgotten. The strategic consequences of American carrier efficiency extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories in the Philippine Sea and off Okinawa. Control of the sea and air around Japanese-held islands allowed American forces to bypass and isolate enemy garrisons, implementing the island-hopping strategy that brought American forces steadily closer to Japan. Each island taken provided another airbase for strikes against the next target. The fall of the Marianas in summer 1944 enabled B-29 bomber raids against Japanese cities. The capture of Iwo Jima in February 1945 provided an emergency landing field for damaged bombers and a base for escort fighters. Okinawa, secured by June 1945 despite kamikaze attacks, offered staging areas for the planned invasion of Japan itself. Japanese strategic planners understood they had lost the carrier war by late 1944, but they could not accept the logical conclusion that Japan had lost the entire war. Pride, honor, and political considerations prevented rational assessment. The decision to employ kamikaze tactics reflected this disconnect from reality. Kamikazes achieved impressive kill ratios. Estimates suggested one hit for every 6 to 8 suicide attempts, but Japan was trading trained pilots for damaged ships that America could repair or replace. The exchange rate favored America overwhelmingly. Japan needed to sink carriers to alter the strategic balance, damaging destroyers and transports, while tactically successful, accomplished nothing strategically. American industrial production simply replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before American carriers faced their ultimate planned test, supporting the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall would have required American carriers to operate in confined waters near Japan for months while supporting amphibious landings against fanatically defended beaches. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan retained over 5,000 aircraft for kamikaze attacks against an invasion fleet. Some American naval officers privately expressed relief that the atomic bombs ended the war before Downfall began, sparing both sides the horrific casualties such an operation would have caused. The efficiency of American carrier operations would have mattered little if overwhelmed by sheer numbers of suicide attackers in restricted waters with limited room to maneuver. The technological and procedural advances developed during the Pacific Carrier War influenced post-war naval aviation profoundly. The lessons learned about damage control, flight deck operations, and pilot training became foundational doctrine for the emerging jet age. Many Essex-class carriers served through the Korean War and Vietnam War after modernization, their basic designs proving adaptable to new aircraft and weapons. The organizational efficiency that allowed World War II carriers to sustain high operational tempos became standard practice, refined and improved, but recognizable in its essentials through the Cold War and beyond. The human legacy proved harder to measure. Many flight deck crews and pilots who survived the war never spoke of their experiences, keeping the terror and intensity locked inside for decades. Some suffered nightmares throughout their lives. Others adjusted to civilian life with apparent ease, though families noticed certain triggers. Loud noises, crowds, sudden movements that produced disproportionate reactions. The Navy learned lessons about combat stress from the Pacific War that influenced how it prepared and supported sailors in subsequent conflicts, though understanding of psychological trauma remained primitive by modern standards. The carriers themselves enjoyed mixed fates. Several Essex-class ships served into the 1970s, their hulls finally too worn for further service. Others were decommissioned soon after the war, victims of defense budget cuts and changing naval requirements. USS Bunker Hill, despite surviving her terrible ordeal off Okinawa, never operated aircraft again after repairs. She was decommissioned in 1947 and eventually scrapped, her sacrifice remembered by those who served aboard her but largely forgotten by the wider public. USS Intrepid found a different fate, becoming a museum ship in New York City where flying sailors can walk her flight deck and imagine the controlled chaos that once reigned there. The efficiency Japanese pilots could not believe, the seeming impossibility of American carriers launching fighters faster than kamikazes could crash into them, rested on unglamorous foundations, superior training, relentless practice, sound engineering, and men working together under unimaginable stress. There was nothing supernatural about it, no special American genius. The system worked because every element functioned as designed, and every person executed their role correctly. In that respect, it represented the fullest expression of industrial-age warfare. Complex systems operated by trained personnel producing predictable results regardless of individual heroism or cowardice. The human element mattered enormously, but it mattered in aggregate rather than individually. This was war as organized process rather than glorious adventure, and it was devastatingly effective. On September 2, 1945, representatives of the Japanese government stood on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay and signed instruments of surrender, ending the Pacific War. Aircraft from American carriers circled overhead in perfect formation, a final demonstration of the air power that had defeated Japan. Among the carriers present was USS Enterprise, veteran of more battles than any other ship in the Navy. Her crew lined the rails, watching history unfold. They understood what civilians could never fully grasp, that this moment represented not just military victory, but the triumph of organization, training, and systematic efficiency over courage and tradition. The kamikaze pilots who had died in vain had been as brave as any warriors in history, but bravery alone could not overcome the machine America had built, the carrier force that could sustain losses and continue fighting, that launched aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them, that turned the Pacific Ocean into an American lake through operational excellence rather than individual heroism. The carrier war taught harsh lessons about modern conflict. Industrial capacity mattered more than warrior spirit. Systematic training defeated individual skill. Organizational efficiency triumphed over tactical innovation. These truths contradicted romanticized notions of warfare that emphasized heroic individuals and decisive moments. The reality was grimmer and more impressive. Victory belonged to whoever could maintain logistical support, replace losses, and sustain operations through grinding attrition. American carriers proved this thesis in the crucible of combat. They kept launching fighters because they had fuel to burn, ordnance to expend, pilots to fly, and crews trained to make it all work under impossible conditions. The men who made the system work returned to civilian life and tried to forget. Most succeeded eventually, though certain sounds or smells would trigger memories. Aviation fuel, the smell of the ocean, the whine of propellers. They had been part of something immense. A historical turning point where naval warfare transformed forever. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the dominant warship, a revolution they had helped prove through practice rather than theory. They had worked on flight decks where one mistake meant death, where fear was constant but had to be controlled, where the work never stopped until finally, mercifully, it did. The carriers themselves sailed on into the future, evolving with technology while maintaining their essential mission, projecting power through naval aviation. The efficiency that Japanese pilots could not believe became standard practice, refined and improved through decades of peacetime training and occasional combat. Modern carriers launch aircraft with even greater efficiency than their World War II predecessors, using catapults and procedures that trace their lineage directly to the Essex-class ships that won the Pacific War. The system works because it was built on solid foundations by men who learned through experience what worked and what killed. History remembers the pilots and the ships, the battles and the admirals. But the true story of American carrier dominance lives in the details. The ordnance crew who could reload 6 machine guns in 4 minutes, the flight deck director whose hand signals guided aircraft through crowded decks without collision, the damage control party who fought fires while their ship burned around them. These men, mostly forgotten, made possible the impossible thing Japanese pilots witnessed. Carriers that could not be killed, that launched fighters without pause, that turned the Pacific Ocean into a graveyard for Japanese naval aviation. Their legacy lives not in monuments, but in the continued effectiveness of the weapon system they perfected under fire. The aircraft carrier, still the dominant instrument of naval power, 70 years after they proved its worth.